Today we're going to continue to work with contour and cross-contour lines. In our previous videos, we worked with 4 simple forms of the cube, the cylinder, the cone, and the sphere. We learned how to draw the contour outline of those objects and apply some cross-contour lines inside of the objects to show the movement of the surface. We are now going to go on to a more complicated form, in this case an organic item, and that is going to be this apple. So this image of the apple is provided to you on your assignment, so you'll want to bring this up so you have it to view while you're drawing. Now when working with a more complicated form like an organic form, you want to look at a few things. One is possibly any simple shapes that could be used to help place important parts of that more complicated form, or some line movement around the outside edge. So I'm not going to come in with my pencil on my paper and start trying to sketch the full apple here. I'm going to roughly map it out. So what I like to do is maybe look for certain features, like this apple has a little bit more of a flat side to it over here. So I'm going to just indicate that with a line. Above that, it has a slight flatness here. And I'm going to again just mark that with the line. Back around the back, there is a flatness back here, and those two connect with a curve. To the end of that, I see a little bit of a flatness here, and it goes into a flatness down here. And that flatness is kind of opposite this one. So I want it kind of in line with this flatness here. And it's not quite the same size. And then we get into a little bit of a flatness here. So I'm using some simple lines here to kind of get an idea of the outline movement of my object. So once I have this, then I'm going to start connecting these pieces a little bit more and refining it. So again, I am adding some lines to this that are going to start darkening the form. I'm going to try to pay attention to some movement on that outside contour. If a line comes in from the original directional plane line I added, or if it moves further away out from it, I'm going to just try to sketch these movements and start piecing together the outline of my object. I'm also going to try to judge where certain parts may be opposite others, because I may have something maybe drawn too large, and I do seem to have this maybe a little bit longer than it needed to be. But this is why we lightly sketch. I'm not trying to make this permanent yet. I'm not getting into any darker lines. Or permanent lines. I'm just trying to get a little bit better outline shape. So I did have it a little bit too long in my original planning, and I've now shortened it up. And what I did was I kind of looked to see where this furthest down dropped curve was in relationship to this highest point. So if my highest point is here, they're almost opposite each other. So I wanted to bring this over a little bit more this way. So then that means I just had to move all the rest of my lines to get the outline of the apple shape. Once I have that, then I'm going to start with some information I need on the inside, and that's going to be this stem area of the apple. So taking a look here, I'm going to again use some lines to help me locate that. So I'm going to use the stem itself as a way of locating that area and getting it placed on here. So I have a fairly good contour outline of my apple. Once I have this, I want to now fill it in with cross contour lines. Now, if you have an actual physical item in front of you, if you had an actual apple, it'd be easy because you could just take your finger, touch the three-dimensional object, move it along that surface, and get the idea of the movement of that surface. When you're working with an image, you have to look for certain details of the image that will help you with the contour outline. So one of those is going to be the fact that there's shadows and highlights on this apple. So I can already see here that something happens, that this shadow comes off the side of the apple and doesn't continue up around like this shadow does around this brighter red. I also notice that here where I drew in the stem, I see a little bit of a highlight that leads this way, and I already kind of started to draw that idea of it when I was putting in this curve. And you can see it also, the shape of these highlights over here that give us an idea of what that surface movement looks like for this apple. I can also use the coloration. Here I can see where fingers of darker value come towards the stem. So most likely that means the surface movement is going to also mimic that on that area of the apple. So when you start the contour outline, those are some things you want to look at. Look at your shadows, look at your highlights, look at your value changes, and also the outer contour we just drew will help give you some indication of what surface movement looks like. So once I have an idea of what I'm looking for, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start putting in some cross contour. So that's the beginning to some of my cross contour outlines. So I mainly worked from coming from the stem and working my way down towards the bottom of the apple. This gives me some information on surface movement. Now it's going to be the crossover contour that's going to help me with a little more of that. So I notice here, as I said before, that there's a line here, so that indicates me that there's a major surface movement here. In fact, it seems as if it flattens out a little bit. So when I start a cross contour in this direction, I want to show that movement by changing the angle of the line. So if I come here with a slight curve or even a straight line to indicate that little bit of flatness, where it seems to bend over or roll over this edge and continue into the contour heading in this direction, which seems to flatten out a little bit, indicated by that shadow, how it's a little bit straight across here. That's what I'm going to work with. And then it says I get over here further that I notice curves to my shadow a little bit more. That gives me an idea of a little bit more of the surface movement. So now I'm going to come across the lines I just did, take it from what kind of looks almost like a pumpkin when I do the, I guess you could say if it was sitting on the base with the stem upwards, vertical movement. And I'm going to try to add some details here of how the apple surface appears to move looking at my highlights and shadows. So once again, I see a little bit of movement around that core. There's definitely movement in front of that core. And just trying to get an idea of what the surface movement and the shadows and highlights are telling me about that surface movement. So that's our exercise for today, is to try to create the surface movement of this apple using this photo reference. You want to pay attention to highlights, shadows, any parts of the contour outline of the shape of the apple to give you an indication of where movement might change. And start wrapping these contour outlines around your object. So this is eventually going to lead to our project, which is going to be creating a drawing in which we use contour outlines for the surface of our object. So instead of our normal shading practices and our normal coloring, we're going to just use line, pure and simple, to help us identify the surface movement and the three-dimensional form of our object. If you do use your own item, if you have an apple at home and you want to use that for your practice, just make sure you take a photograph of the apple and upload it with a photograph of your finished product so that I can view your exercise and see what the surface looked like on the item you were looking at. To be able to help you with any suggestions if they are needed. So there's my finished apple contour outline. Well, I do have the stem here, in which I am going to also complete the contour outline. And once I have that finished, I will have my completed contour outline drawing of my object. And ready for my next stage, which will be working with a more complicated form and completing the exact same exercise of applying contour outlines and cross contour lines inside.